Last time on the Playmates Star Trek Retrospective.
Pretty nice start overall. You have most of the main cast except for Dr. Crusher. Wow, there is so much red here you'd think it was a Power Rangers toy line. This TOS box set honoring the legacy of the original series. That is the farthest thing from authentic I can think of.
And now, the continuation.
Personal log, Lieutenant Junior Grade Soundout. So it turns out that I did in fact have a Mordok the Benzite this entire time. Much like last time, I don't own every single figure, nor do I own every accessory, and the accessories aren't a major focus, otherwise these videos would be 3 hours long. For figures I don't own, I'm using images from the awesome website Wixaban. Check them out for all kinds of information on the Playmates Star Trek line, as well as other Star Trek toy and merchandise lines. It's a fantastic resource. Hello, this is Soundout here, and welcome to part 2 of the Star Trek Playmates Toys Retrospective. Today we'll be covering all of 1994. Now, unlike last time where we took a look at 2 years together, this time we're just looking at 1 year, and boy is there a lot of figures. 59 to be exact. It's quite a loaded year, double of the previous year, and there's very good reason. Next Generation was wrapping up its final season on the air, and as we were saying goodbye to the Next Generation crew, Deep Space Nine was starting to get some traction, but of course it was rejected for being not like Star Trek and too different. But that changed over time. And of course, Playmates, wanting to capitalize on the newness of Deep Space Nine, released its first series of Deep Space Nine action figures. Following that, of course, we get another series of Next Generation action figures, some based on the later seasons, including Season 6, and starting to include Season 7, and, of course, the first Next Generation film, Star Trek Generations, hits theaters in November of 1994. And boy, oh boy, is there some stuff to talk about when it comes to that movie. It definitely seemed like they waved goodbye to the Enterprise D, just to say hello again to blow up the Enterprise D. And we'll get into all of that. The year came to a close with another series of Next Generation figures, which rounded out the whole section. So, without further ado, let's continue our look into the Playmates Toys Star Trek line with the first series of Deep Space Nine.
Traveler, welcome to the promenade. Humble quark at your service. Behold, Star Trek Deep Space Nine action figures. Commander Benjamin Sisko, he helps me run the station. And Security Chief Odo, very strict and sneaky for someone so honest. Here's Lieutenant Dax, Chief O'Brien, and Major Kira Nerys. I happen to know she's crazy about me. Wonderful, aren't they? Especially this one. So handsome. Pains me to part with it, but if you pay me now... security. What a pleasant surprise.
So Series 1 of Deep Space Nine comes on this really neat packaging. I do love the tagline Beyond the Final Frontier, and I find it amusing that the Deep Space Nine video game that they've been advertising since 1993 still hasn't come out yet. Now that being said, the figures include an action base of multiple variety of types depending on which character it is, and the articulation is exactly what you would expect from the line so far. Our first figure of the series is Commander Benjamin Sisko. Being the lead character of Deep Space Nine, of course, he's the first figure in this wave. And I gotta say, it's a pretty decent figure overall. I think the likeness is a little off from Avery Brooks, but the uniform itself is fairly accurate. And hey, it's a pretty nice Season 1 and Season 2 Commander Sisko figure. And I like the accessories he comes with, very specific stuff. Plus, he's an entirely new body mold that will be reused many, many times. Next up, we have Odo, the Chief of Security for Deep Space Nine. Affiliated with the Bajorans, this changeling makes a really neat action figure. I think because of the makeup work, it did give a better likeness, though it's kind of a strange in-between point between a couple different looks for the character. But overall, pretty nice figure. So next up, we have Quark, the humble... no. The good... nah. The owner of Quark's Bar and several places on the promenade in Deep Space Nine. A very fun character, a very memorable one, and a character who's apparently been franchising his businesses everywhere according to Lower Decks, which is impressive. You gotta get that Latinum somehow. Quark also brings us a new body type for the Ferengi, which is much better than that weird one from Next Gen. Next up, we have Chief Miles O'Brien. Now, O'Brien actually originated on TNG as a recurring guest star and had several storylines to himself. He was quite frequently the transporter chief, and he was very frequent around the ship. So it was nice to see that the character got to become main series regular status with Deep Space Nine. And I love the fact the figure has his rolled up sleeves. It's very in character for O'Brien. Jadzia Dax. Now this is a figure that is pretty solid overall outside of a uniform color, which we'll talk about later in the video. But this is a early season 1 Jadzia, and we don't really get an updated head sculpt. They tend to use this head for pretty much every Jadzia from here on out, so get used to it. That being said, it is very well painted with the trill markings on her face. I'm very, very glad that's a nice detail because it's a very distinctive part of the overall look of Jadzia Dax. Kira is the next figure, and she was in charge of Deep Space Nine prior to Sisko's arrival, so I'm glad she's in the first wave, especially since she's the first officer of Deep Space Nine. And it's a very nice figure overall. The haircut is her post-pilot, so I'm glad we have that, because it would have been really weird if she had the haircut from the pilot that she pretty much ditched by the second episode. So overall, it's a very nice early Deep Space Nine Kira action figure. Next up, Gul Dukat. Our first Cardassian in the line, and he is labeled as Commander Gul Dukat on the packaging, which is not accurate because Gul is a rank, Dukat is his name, but luckily the stand gets it correct on the sticker on the bottom. But overall, it's a kind of a weird figure because I think it was supposed to be a generic Cardassian according to the pamphlet from '93, and it really doesn't look like Gul Dukat specifically, which is really a shame because this is a character that's been around since the Next Generation and should have had something a little bit better. Dr. Bashir is the last Starfleet officer from the main cast of Deep Space Nine, and a very solid figure overall. I think the skin tone is a little lighter than it should be, but overall, a fairly decent likeness, and then I actually gotta say, Playmates is starting to get better at the faces. I hope none of this takes a nosedive in quality anytime soon, because this is a really good trend going forward. Morn is the last figure of Series 1, and hey, he's a frequent patron at Quark's and other places on the Promenade, so it's nice to have a Morn figure, and it's fairly accurate. I really see nothing wrong with it. Overall, Series 1 of Deep Space Nine I feel is much more solid than Series 1 of Next Generation. We get all the main players of the series, plus Gul Dukat and Morn, just to kind of round out the bunch. There's definitely more figures to come for Deep Space Nine over the next several years, and I definitely look forward to taking a look at these, but this is a very, very solid start. So Deep Space Nine Series 1 was only 9 figures, as opposed to the 10 from Series 1 and Next Generation. My guess is that Jake Sisko was planned for this series. He did appear on a pamphlet that was prior to the launch of these figures, and he probably just got pushed to Wave 2 for some reason, and we'll look at him in 1995's video. But continuing in 1994, the Next Generation line got a refresh of packaging with a nice little fancy gold 7th season sticker and 19 new figures. And by new figures, I mean 19 new figures, not 19 new characters. There's sadly a limited amount of new characters in Series 3 of the Next Generation compared to the previous 2 and ones that'll come later. So released across 3 different ways, these 19 figures feature predominantly variations of the primary cast of the Next Generation in episode-specific looks, such as Data as a Romulan or Worf in a Starfleet rescue outfit. So I don't own a lot of these, and I didn't feel like buying a lot of these for the video, as I just don't have a place for my collection once the video's done. But to compensate for that, I will spend a little bit more time comparing the likenesses of the figures, even though I just have photo reference to go off of. So let's begin the 3rd series of the Next Generation.
The adventure continues. In disguise, Picard, Data, and Riker are caught in the laser crossfire. It's a narrow escape. Back on the Starship Enterprise, Counselor Troy has the bridge. Suddenly, there's an explosion. Overcome by a parasite, Geordi is out of control. Lieutenant Worf and Lieutenant Barclay lure him off to sickbay with a holographic image of his friend, Hugh Borg. Calm is finally restored to the bridge. Temporarily. Star Trek, The Next Generation, bridge playset and action figures, new from Playmates.
Series 3 shipped in a few different waves, so the packaging's a little different on some of these. Overall, though, it is a darker color scheme compared to the Series 1 and 2 releases, and sometimes features a 7th season sticker on it. There also is advertising that Deep Space Nine video game, which apparently still isn't out yet. Also, there was a Design an Alien contest where you could get a part walking onto the show. I wonder who won that. Of this series, most figures include the normal Starfleet action base, but there are other variations depending on the alien species they're associated with, and articulation is what you'd expect from the line so far. First up, Lieutenant Commander Data as a Romulan. It's pretty much all you need to know. It's from Unification. It's neat, but hey, we're getting Romulans disguised, but not actual Romulans, which is kind of a bummer, because, again, there's not really that many Romulans. To go alongside this, Captain Picard is a Romulan, just to go with Data. There's really no other reason. There was an episode with very impressive makeup effects called Identity Crisis, where Geordi got turned into an alien. To replicate that, we have an action figure. This will not be the last time we see this mold, actually, which is surprising. The episode First Contact had Riker disguised as a Malkorian. This is Riker disguised as a Malkorian. I think you might start to understand why I don't own some of these figures. It's nice that they're new molds at the very least. Next up, we have Deanna Troi in her proper Starfleet uniform. Great looking figure, love the overall look. For whatever reason, she is incredibly green. And I can't blame Playmates on this one because the production couldn't even decide if these uniforms were blue, blue-green, teal, cyan, or just any variety of colors, sometimes in the same scene. And when you look at the actual costumes at an auction, they're not even the same color. There's an article I'll link down below if you really want to see all the differences in colors and shading for these uniforms, because it gave me a headache. Next figure I don't own, Worf in a Starfleet Rescue uniform from Birthright. It's essentially Worf in a jumpsuit with a belt. Not exactly the most exciting figure, and it seems to be reusing that same really weird Worf head sculpt. At least his body is in the right proportion. Next up is Hugh Borg. Now this figure is based off of the character of Hugh from the episode I, Borg. He is a Borg separated from the collective, and the ensuing fallout of what that means made one of the best episodes of The Next Generation and absolutely one of my favorites. And I'm glad the character got to come back for Star Trek Picard. And I really like this figure. Overall, pretty accurate likeness, and out of all the Borg figures, he's probably the closest to the actual costume. Lieutenant Reginald Barclay is a recurring guest star in The Next Generation, and I think he's a very fascinating character because he's not a model Starfleet officer, but he is lieutenant, and he is intelligent when he can apply himself. His unsuredness about himself and, kind of his own character flaws is what made him really interesting and what made him a popular guest star. And this figure's a great look of his TNG era uniform, and I'm glad that he finally joined the lineup. It definitely seemed like he was one that was kind of missing from the Next Generation family. Dr. Noonien Soong is the creator of Data and Lore. He appeared in the episode Brothers, which is also the debut for Lore, and while he had a limited appearance, I'm glad he got an action figure. I think he's significant enough to the universe to deserve a figure, and it's the kind of thing that Playmates really excelled at, was making one-off characters and making them really good figures. Q in his judge robes, most famously seen in Encounter at Farpoint and All Good Things. This is the iconic Q look, because it's not him imitating anyone else. It is him, Regal Q, judging us all. And honestly, it's a pretty decent figure, except for the fact that his articulation is complete trash. Because of the robes, no real leg movement, and barely any arm movement. But his accessories are really fun, I'll give him that. Continuing to fill out the Next Generation roster is Ensign Ro Laren, another frequent guest star on the series, and one I'm glad made it into the line. She was a character that kind of got left on a cliffhanger note, but at least her legacy is represented in plastic. And I was pretty impressed because she doesn't reuse the body mold from Deanna Troi. And you wonder why that might be impressive, just wait a few more minutes into this video and you'll see why. Our random alien of the week is Esok. Now this is one of those crazy alien creatures. Someone at Playmates must have loved it and just said, we gotta make a figure. And he kind of seems like he got lost from Series 1 because he's got kind of like that weird pre-posed foot nature that a lot of the early figures had that later figures didn't. So it's kind of interesting. He's a little bit out of place, but I like him. He's really cool looking and it's a unique alien that most people forget even existed. Picard as Dixon Hill is a frequent thing in The Next Generation. Picard loves playing the character Dixon Hill on the holodeck, and this action figure represents him in a gray suit, mentions the big goodbye specifically. I have a version of Dixon Hill in a brown suit that we'll look at in a later video. I just didn't want to open this figure because it would be a little redundant in my loose collection. Next up, Lieutenant Commander Data in a dress uniform. There's nothing else to say. Captain Picard in duty uniform is basically just saying it's Captain Picard in his Season 3 uniform. This is great because it's a figure we didn't have since the first Picard in Series 1 was based on his captain's jacket look. This is a figure I might pick up if I ever run across it, but without a proper Season 3 Riker, without the battle damage, it just doesn't seem worth it to me. Ensign Wesley Crusher, or acting Ensign Wesley Crusher, was his earlier uniform when he got one on the Enterprise D, and sadly this starts a trend where they took the Wesley head, which already wasn't great, slapped it on Barclay's body, painted that body red, and painted over one of the rank pips and hope he didn't notice. This is gonna happen a few more times. Speaking of, Gowron in Ritual Klingon armor is the Worf in Klingon armor with Gowron's head, which means it doesn't really match anything, even though they painted some medals on it to try and get something. This last batch of the wave really feels phoned in. Thomas Riker, the transporter clone of William Riker, is the Will Riker from Series 1 painted yellow. No work was done to remove the battle damage, it's just there. And for some reason, this figure was incredibly hard to find, commanding hundreds of dollars in the aftermarket back in the 90s, and still goes for like 30 bucks. Like, is he just that limited now? Or that limited then? This last part of the series is weird. You have some phoned-in figures that go for a lot of money. And now we have a figure that's rare for probably a good reason. Lieutenant Commander Data as seen in Redemption is a misnomer. It's actually Data from Chain of Command Part 2, where he wore the red uniform when he was told to be the first officer. And this figure was limited to 7,000 units, exclusive to JCPenney. In the US, it was released in a 4-pack with 3 other figures that you could get separately, and this was also released in Canada, but never released internationally, which means it's actually pretty hard to find. So while it's kind of a decent figure, it's just Data painted red, it's really hard to get, and it only represents one episode, just not the episode they claimed it to be. It should be noted that while they're on the back of the package, Luxwana Troy and Ambassador Sarek were not included in this packaging in the US, but they were included in this packaging in Canada. We will look at these figures in the Next Generation Series 4 section. So looking at the 7 figures I do own from this series, there's 12 I don't, which I think I've outlined why. It's a nice addition to the Next Generation roster, though it does feel like having a dedicated Next Generation line seeming to run its course. There's just a lot of repetition. But hey, at least these figures, the ones at least I have, do make good additions to the collection. And overall, the Next Generation cast does look good together, even if their uniforms are all mismatched, adding Barclay, Rowe, and Deanna in her proper uniform. And now we've come to the most contentious part of this year's releases. The Star Trek Generations line is infamously terrible. And guess what? It definitely is, and we'll get into that. However, I do think there is many reasons contributing to its general awfulness. For example, the Star Trek Generations film was first conceived in around 1992 and was released in 1994. Pretty quick turnaround for a movie, all things considered, especially when the first draft wasn't done until 1993. In fact, the movie was shot in 51 days and began filming before the Next Generation even finished its 7th season, and the actors had 4 days off before going off to film a movie, and this movie also was shot in May of 94 and released in November of 94. So a bit of a rush production, and hey, they got the movie out and it was mostly successful, if not the critical darling that they wanted it to be. However, this led a strain on Playmates toys, as they had a very, very small window to produce toys based on this movie in order for them to be out on time. In fact, if the movie's first draft was conceived in 1993, that's the earliest stage of pre-production. And if a normal toy production schedule is about a year, that meant that Playmates had less than a year to get these figures produced and shipped to get in stores for that November release. And what was the sacrifice made? Well, in my opinion, that was the articulation. These figures are infamous for having reduced the number of points of articulation down to 5. Hips, shoulders, and head. They are very, very basic. They're not very detailed. There's not a lot of new accessories, even though all the figures are brand new molds. And that has led to, I think, the figures getting a bad reputation because of it. They don't hold up to the quality of most of the rest of the line. And that's unfortunate because this is the only time some of these characters got made. And yeah, we're going to go into the details of each figure, but in a general sense, it definitely seemed like Playmates had to rush these out the door, and from what I know about toy production, it's way easier to produce a figure that's only 6 parts as opposed to one that's 9 or 10 parts like the normal figures are. So, honestly, I'm not going to try to rag on the Generations line. We all know it's bad. It's a footnote, but it's got some interesting history, especially when we talk about the Next Generation cast and their uniforms. So let's crack into the Star Trek Generations line.
The remote corner of our galaxy is a place where the future connects with the past. Where two generations shall meet to join forces in a battle to save the universe. Star Trek Generations, new action figures and accessories from Playmates.
So the packaging for the Generations line is kind of a weird, grungy look. It's orange and black. It's not too exciting, to be honest, or it's just because I've seen it so much. These figures were definitely produced in large quantities to time with the movie, but they weren't that popular. And also, there was 2 assortments for some reason. 14 figures in one and 16 in the other. And they all come with the same mini poster, which means if you bought all the figures, you have 16 of these. Articulation-wise, like I said, limited. I did say 5 points before. It actually is 6. I forgot about the waist swivel. And every figure comes with the same action base, being the new comm badge design, regardless of their affiliation. First up, we start a trio of veteran characters, starting with Admiral James T. Kirk. He should have been a captain by this point because he was demoted in Star Trek IV. But overall, it's a fairly decent figure. It kind of matches the uniform okay. It could be better, but it could be a lot worse. For some reason, though, these figures come with TOS accessories instead of the movie ones. Second in the trio is a Scotty, and hey, he's a different mold. I do appreciate the fact that all the Generation figures are new molds, even if they have that weird pre-posedness due to lack of articulation thing. Overall, a fairly decent figure. You know, he's reusing the head from Relic Scotty, which is fine. It was in the same time frame. Rounding out the trio is Chekhov. Like the other two, decent likeness, overall accuracy of the costume's pretty solid, and yeah, it's a nice trio, but we're missing 4 crew members in these uniforms that got used for 6 movies, and spoiler alert, they never made the others. Alright, before we get into the concept abandoned uniform designs that these figures are based on, let me direct you to a video by Junkball Transmission. After watching this video, go check this out if you want the full story on why these uniforms ended up not happening for the movie. It's very fascinating and he has a much better breakdown than what I can provide within the context of this video. But speaking of context, in the film itself, the uniforms were a mix of TNG and Deep Space Nine ones, sometimes within the same scene, which frustrates my brain a little bit. And yeah, we have some concept art as well as a prototype costume to kind of go off of to see what these costumes would have looked like in the movie. So we're going to use those with a little Photoshop tweaking to see how they would have turned out. So like I mentioned in the prologue to this segment, these costumes were definitely not finalized before the figures had to be produced, so Playmates Toys had to work off the concept art. And comparing Picard to his concept art, spot on. Playmates did a really good job. It's actually pretty impressive how all the details match. So you can definitely tell that these were the concept designs translated into figure form. So now Riker's packaging lists his rank as Lieutenant Commander, so unless there was a abandoned plot point where he got demoted, it should say Commander Riker. And the rank pips on the figure are correct. So someone screwed up somewhere. Deanna Troi gets her second proper uniform figure this year. And hey, it's also green, even though the concept art is definitely blue. Playmates was sticking to science is green, and I'll applaud the consistency. Now something with these Generations figures, like you can see with Data here, is the tendency to just use the heads from the previous figures and slap them on new bodies. But hey, at least we get new bodies. And honestly, it's kind of neat to see what these would have looked like. So what's interesting with the Worf figure is that he actually has a new head sculpt, unlike the others, and this is a much, much improved head sculpt over the previous Worf head sculpts. He's not snarling anymore, he's got more of a serious, stern look to him. I really like it. I hope it gets used on another figure in the future. Also, is it just me or is it weird seeing Worf without a sash? I don't know if that was just the concept art, but like, it's bizarre. So next up we have Geordi, and this is actually the only actor we have an image of for wearing this concept uniform, and it's in a deleted scene that's in really terrible VHS quality, but LeVar Burton did wear this, at least briefly, even though he's been asked in interviews and does not remember that. Also, the visor was apparently removable on this figure because I don't know where it is. So Dr. Crusher, honestly, not a bad figure. It's our second Crusher, first one without a lab coat. Yes, she is green and not blue-green or whatever, but technically they're green in the movie, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And honestly, the whole set together, it's kind of nice to have this concept what-if design for the Next Generation crew, and I kind of appreciate having figures of that, even if it doesn't represent anything that ever truly existed. Finally reaching new characters, we have Dr. Soran. Now this is a character that was very, very hated upon release of the film, mostly for something he does at the end of the movie. And unfortunately Malcolm McDowell got a lot of bad fan mail. And hey, if you're ever going to harass an actor over something a character does, get a reality check. Continuing the trend of concept uniforms is Guinan. This costume, I was able to find the matching, corresponding concept art for this, and I was very proud because that was a bit of a dig to find. Thanks to Trek Corps for having it. The figure is 100% the concept art, which sort of resembles the movie, but not quite, just like the other concept figures. Honestly, I know it's like an alternate history thing, but I kind of dig these new uniforms, especially seeing them all together and with Guinan. Continuing the new character trend, we have Beator. Of course, Lursa's the next figure, but the Duras sisters were semi-regular guest stars for a bit. They appeared on TNG, they showed up on DS9, and they were some of the main villains of Generations, so it was nice to see figures. The only downside of these figures is they were releasing the Generations line, which means they lack articulation to properly hold batliths, which I take as a down credit, and their articulation is just even worse than some of the others because of the skirts. Continuing the overall trend of things that never existed, we have Kirk in a spacesuit. Now this is actually not a spacesuit, it's an orbital skydiving suit from a deleted opening scene of the movie, which there is footage of. If you want to go look it up, it's in the sources in the description. And we actually have a picture of the costume thanks to an auction. This costume resurfaced in Voyager for Belena Torres to use, but yeah, never happened in the actual film from a deleted scene, but hey, it's got an action figure at least. The last figure of the wave is an infamous one, Pirate Worf. There was a scene in the movie on the holodeck with the Next Generation crew doing a naval ceremony to announce Worf's promotion, and Worf was a pirate in that, for whatever reason, and they decided, hey, out of all the figures we could base off that scene, let's do Worf. And it's not even accurate, because of course, concept art. Also, this figure comes with a pirate sword and stuff. It's kind of goofy and weird, and he has a different head sculpt than the Worf in uniform, so yeah, they were really giving Worf love this series. Just sucks that there's no articulation in those arms. So of the 16 figures in the Generation series, 8 of them are concepts, 1 of them's from a deleted scene, 3 of them are new characters they'll never be made again, and 3 of them are characters in outfits people wanted, but they never completed the set on. This is one giant bubble of disappointment, and is the epitome of a movie tie-in line gone wrong. If Playmates had been given the time to do these properly, they could have been reusing Deep Space Nine bodies and probably made a better assortment. But sadly, this is what we got, and sadly, or not sadly, depending on your preference, you can find these pretty much anywhere. They are some of the most common and easiest figures to get from this line. I've never had trouble finding any of these. So next up, we have the 4th series of the Next Generation. This one snuck out a few figures in '94, so we're talking about it now. We'll just be talking about the first wave of Series 4, branded under the Season 7 packaging, and it's 7 figures. Quick and simple, and more will follow in '95. So, packaging for Series 4, pretty nice, looks a little updated, the Enterprise in a different orientation. There were 9 figures released in the first wave. They started adding this thing called Important Note to Collectors. In the case here, it specifically mentions how Data is actually in the uniform he wore, since Generations had just come out and had the wrong figures with the wrong uniforms, and that Deep Space Nine video game is still coming soon. Also of note, the figures are now packaged on the right-hand side of the bubble, as opposed to the left-hand side. So I'm ready to crack into Next Gen Series 4 with a bunch of new stuff, right? Oh, it's Geordi, and his head's on Sisko's body. Yeah, so we have the Geordi LaForge in movie uniform, which in the movie he wore Colm Meaney's DS9 jumpsuit with the sleeves rolled down, and so for the figure they put him in the Sisko body with the Geordi head, and called it a day. Dr. Crusher in duty uniform. Now this one is sort of branded as a Generations figure, which is true. She didn't wear the overcoat in Generations from what I could tell from scrubbing through the movie to do screenshots. Yeah, hey, it did look green in Generations at least, but it is the Deanna figure with a Crusher head, and at least it matches something that was a frequent look in the series. Also of note, this figure was packed with either a TNG era comm badge base or a Generations era comm badge base. And I also noticed that the figure picture on the back of the card is the Dax body with Crusher's head, which is not what she wore in the movie, because she wore the other one with the different comm badge that was now green suddenly because of blue. Instead it was an actual color change, but it could be something else. Next up, Data in movie uniform. It's Sisko's body in gold with Data's head. Pretty straightforward. Also of note, when I went to open this figure and I opened up the cards, I noticed that on the back it said the Borg, which I thought was a misprint, but then I opened the pack of cards and it was a pack of cards. It wasn't just one, it was 3, which I don't know if that's a misprint because I had another figure that we'll look at next time that also had extra cards. But the figure itself is essentially Data in a DS9 uniform, which is accurate to the film into what he wore for the majority of it. So that's pretty neat. Also, they just skirted by with those rank pips to be accurate. Next up, Tasha Yar. This is a character that appeared in Season 1 of The Next Generation before being unceremoniously killed off because her actress asked to have a bigger part than just stand on the bridge, which wasn't unreasonable. She was a series regular, but the producers told her she was fired, which was really a shame because the character had potential. Luckily, Denise Crosby is able to create the character of Sela to continue work on the show, and it's great that we have 2 action figures of Denise Crosby, plus it finally rounds out the Season 1 Next Generation characters, even if we're missing Season 1 versions of Crusher and Troy. Next up, another all-new figure, Luxwana Troy. Now this ambassadress to Beta Z is the mother of Deanna Troy and was played by the wonderful Majel Barrett Roddenberry. I gotta say, this figure actually is a pretty good likeness overall, and it does match one of her many outfits from the series. Unfortunately, as an action figure, she's a little limited because of the lack of leg movement, but I gotta say, she looks good with Deanna Troy of whichever costume is your preference. Following up the theme of parents, we have Ambassador Sarek. Now, Sarek is the father of Spock, and he did appear in an episode of TNG prior to Spock's appearance in Unification. It's a really good likeness overall. I think this figure nails Sarek, and you can actually use him not just with your Next Generation figures, but with the original series figures. And I even feel like the Vulcan instrument he comes with fits better with the Spock figure overall. So I'm really glad that Sarek got made into the line because it's an iconic legacy character. Last up, we have the Nausicaan from the episode Tapestry. Now, these are characters very integral to the backstory of Jean-Luc Picard, and I'm very glad that we got a Nausicaan in the line. I couldn't find the exact photo reference for which Nausicaan this was, because there were 3 in the episode, but hey, it's a really good looking figure, because even regardless of accuracy or not, it makes a great, solid looking action figure, and it poses well with other figures in the line. Now, of the 9 figures on the card back, 7 of which actually came out in this first wave. And of these 7, I have 5, and I honestly like these figures. The Data in movie uniform, probably my least favorite, but the other 4 are great new additions to the overall Next Generation roster. And speaking of the Next Generation roster, here is an expanded look at the main characters and recurring guest stars of the Next Generation, now including Tasha Yar. And then also, let's throw in Miles O'Brien, even though his uniform's not correct, but we'll fix that in the next video. So now let's talk about something fun. Playmates Toys own the rights to produce Ninja Turtles and Star Trek, so what did they do? They smashed them together into the Star Trek Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles line. One of the most fun concepts about the late Turtles line was they started doing crossovers. The Turtles were as Universal monsters, or the Turtles were as Starfleet officers. And some of the division choices were kind of iffy. But, that being said, I think these are really fun figures, and I wish I owned them. They've become incredibly rare now, so I only own 2 of them, but we're going to take a look at them anyways. Alright, Star Trek Ninja Turtles. Having trouble getting excited. I only have half the family. You know, the more that I edit this segment, I realize that having 2 out of 4 Ninja Turtles is just really bizarre and unnatural. Maybe I should just cut the entire segment. I just wish that these figures weren't so hard to find and I could have the other 2 for the video. Oh, hey. Some miracle here. We have Chief Medical Officer Raphael and Chief Engineer Michelangelo. I think we're in business now. Alright, let's do this properly this time. The packaging is super excellent. I love the artwork up top, the very goofy 90s Ninja Turtles text that's just kind of a parody of Star Trek. It's very fun. I love the transporter effect with the sewer plate. What's also fun is that they have a base that is the Starfleet Delta in a turtle shell, and the articulation for these figures is mostly the same for most of the figures, where it's got 1 swivel elbow and 1 swivel wrist, but Raphael gets no swivel wrists but 2 swivel elbows because of his short sleeves to match McCoy. First up, Captain Leonardo. Obviously, Leonardo of the Ninja Turtles. as a captain of a Starship Enterprise. And he does look like Jim Kirk. And I gotta say, I love the way these figures turned out because they're incredibly detailed to where it looks like it's fabric over the turtle body, because you can see the details of the shell and the fabric pulling where it's kind of stretched over Ninja Turtle bodies. Also, all these turtles come with the standard TOS accessories with an oversized tricorder, and then a couple weapons that are Trekified versions of their turtle counterparts. Now, while Leo's a good fit for Captain, I don't know how Chief Engineer Michelangelo works out, because that guy, I love him, I love Mikey, but he's like the party dude, not so much we'll be the engineer trying to make sure we don't all explode in some horrible technological fire. But Donnie has a different job, so I guess this one was left to Mikey. You know, I wonder if Chief Medical Officer Raphael, or Dr. McCoy, or Dr. Ta'ana from Lower Decks, which one of them would be worse at bedside manner? Because I feel like Raph might be able to just beat them all up because, like, he would start physically beating people up when he just got too frustrated in a medical room. Either way, I do like those short sleeves. It's a nice touch that references McCoy's short sleeve sickbay look, which we never got a figure of, but that's besides the point. It's a nice homage. And lastly, we have First Officer Donatello. Naturally, Donatello and Spock are just like in the same group in their whole team dynamics, so it makes perfect sense. I love the newly molded forearm to give him a hand where he's doing the Vulcan sign of peace, even though he's only got 3 fingers. I'm not going to question that. It actually probably is easier for him to do it than most humans. So, hey, this Donatello is pretty great. They even gave him the ears. Overall, I love the Star Trek Ninja Turtles figures. They feel ahead of their time because company crossovers is more of a modern thing to do. But I love them. They're fun. They're goofy. They're just so 90s, and I'm really glad to have the whole set finally. It's something I've wanted to complete for years, and I'm glad the opportunity came up just in time for this video. What's interesting is 2 years in a row we have a box set. Last year's box set was the original series crew. This year's is a Starfleet Officers Set where 2/3 of it are in dress uniforms and 1/3 of it is straight repacks. Let's get into it. Alright, the Starfleet Officers box set, not as exciting as the TOS box set. Kira and Cisco are repacks. Cisco in a dress uniform would come later. Riker and Picard are basically using the same mold that dress uniform Geordi and Data used. And then Kirk and Spock are actually new figures, which actually are the only 2 I own. I can't exactly tell you where I picked these up at, but I got them loose because I don't have anything else from the set. But they're fairly decent likenesses and kind of nice variety for the TOS shelf, which doesn't get as many variants as some of the other series. And also this year we had our last playset in the line. Sadly, the engineering playset based on Star Trek Generations is the last playset released, which is a shame because up till now they've all been great. So we salute the playsets of the Star Trek Playmates line as they move their way out into the outer reaches of space. So here's the engineering playset. I don't have any personal experience with this one. It just doesn't seem as exciting as the transporter room, or especially not even close to the bridge. It has some light up warp core stuff. And what's interesting is the figures on the box are Data and Geordi in the proper uniforms, but they aren't the figures that would release, which were reusing Cisco's bodies. It's probably some photo manipulation, but hey, it exists. I wish there was another playset after, so this wasn't the last playset released. Talking about ships in 1994 is a bit of a daunting task. There was more ships released this year than any other year, and they even repacked some within the same year in different boxes. It's all kinds of fun, and I don't own any of them, but I wish I did. This line was really cool, and I really wish I collected ships before a lot of the prices started skyrocketing. But let's dive into it. We're going to take this at Warp Factor 5, because I don't own any of these. The Enterprise from the original series looks great, and ships start including stands now, which is a very, very great thing. Also, the Borg cube from the Next Generation. It's a cube, it makes sounds, it's pretty neat. It was used as a prop in Voyager. Then we have the really grim battle damaged Enterprise D, which was released twice, first in a Generations box where the Enterprise D blew up, and then also in a Next Generation box for funsies. So we have the Enterprise B from Generations, which of course was from the opening sequence. Also the Klingon Bird of Prey in a Generations box because that was the movie at the time. We have the Deep Space Nine space station, which isn't to scale with the other ships, but does include a miniature Enterprise to give you an idea of how large it would be, and that's still pretty large, all things considered. And then lastly, we have a runabout. Runabouts are like shuttlecraft that are bigger and have more weapons, so it holding 2 figures is pretty dang cool, even if it's nowhere close to the right scale. The roleplay line this year also was the largest of the year, and there is plenty here that I don't own, but I got one of them, so that should be kind of fun. So we've got a trio of original series roleplay items, including the classic communicator, which is that awesome flip design, the classic Type 2 phaser, which looks really cool, and the classic tricorder, which is a science tricorder specifically. From Generations, we have a Klingon disruptor, much like the Bird of Prey appears in other things, just movie branding. And then we have a personal communicator based on the new Generations comm badge. I don't own this, but I can imagine, like with the Next Generation one, it's nowhere near accurate to what sound it would actually make. And lastly, we have the Next Generation Type 1 phaser. This is way larger than the one in the series, which is more of a palm-held thing. This one's pretty big, but it's pretty neat. I like it, and it makes some awesome sound effects. So rounding out the year is an introduction of a new scale of figure, the 9-inch action dolls. Now these are kind of based on the Mego figures, the first Star Trek figures released in the 70s, which were an 8-inch doll-like action figure with cloth goods. So Playmates decided, let's do our own. And hey, we're not going to have any from this year, but we'll definitely dive into these because, oh boy, these will overtake the line someday. Part 5 and 6 will be interesting. First assortment of 9-inch action dolls in '94 is the Command Edition, featuring Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Commander Benjamin Sisko, and Captain James T. Kirk in their most iconic outfits. And last up for the 9-inch line is the Movie Edition with Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Captain James T. Kirk, Lieutenant Commander Data, and Lieutenant Commander Geordi LaForge. And this is where the 9-inch bias line starts coming in because all these are accurate to the movie, which then again they could have changed the costumes last minute since those are cloth and not the entire molded figure. And Kirk's got the right rank. It's all kind of weird, but hey, at least something was accurate for Generations. 1994 was a wild year for this line. Plenty of great figures, some Generations figures not as great, tons of ships, tons of roleplay, new 9-inch figure line. They were really firing at all cylinders. This is not the peak of the line, however, because we have even more to cover, especially in 95 and 96. So stay tuned, as part 3 will be coming in the very near future as soon as I can get it produced, and that'll be covering 1995, the year that Voyager joins the lineup, as well as some interesting final remains of the Next Generation line and extensions of Deep Space Nine, before Playmates decides to take all these separate lines and merge them into one. But that's next time. So until then, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out when part 3 is going live. You can also follow me on Twitter at Soundout12, where I'll be tweeting out the video when it goes up. And please share this with all your Star Trek fans and friends out there because I really could use the exposure. It's hard building a Star Trek audience on a channel that has not covered Star Trek extensively in the past, and I hope to build one so I can continue this series with high hopes and lead into next year with the new line and review everything that they want to put out at that point. So please help out if you can. Also leave a like and a comment, as that helps feed the algorithm beast to get this video out to more people. And until then, be sure to check out my awesome graphic designer on Twitter at DarkClaw643 and the awesome website Hero Club at hero-club.com for your sci-fi and hero news and more. Until next time, this is Soundout saying, live long and prosper.